Hi. So good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're connecting from today. And thank you for joining our TrustWorks LinkedIn Live session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Orla Dormer. My background and passion, I suppose, is primarily in education, training and development. And I'm lucky enough, or privileged, whatever you want to say, to be responsible for the TrustWorks Privacy Community. Our key objective really there is to tap into the incredible combined knowledge of our 250 plus members. We communicate via a Slack channel, but we also participate in monthly roundtable discussions. These discussions are not recorded, they're private space to speak freely. And we usually share advice, best practices, experiences, discuss pertinent topics in the area, etc. So if anybody would like to join the community, please feel free to reach out to me directly, or I'll put a link in the comments below. So I'm delighted to say that today is the first LinkedIn Live session where we're going to share takeaways from our most recent roundtable discussion. And so I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Valerie Lyons, experienced privacy professional and author of the best-selling book, The Privacy Leader Compass. Welcome, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Orla. Delighted to be here.
So I've no doubt everybody probably knows you already, but maybe for those who don't, if you could give us kind of a rough idea about your background maybe and how you ended up in the privacy space.
It wasn't by accident. It was very much intentional, but my background was cybersecurity. And if we go back even further, it was actually programming. But I always say that was a toxic relationship for both parties. So it was one that didn't work out too well. I spent then the next 15 years, 20 in fact, in cybersecurity. 15 of those in working in financial regulated firms, namely KBC. So I led the cybersecurity risk management team there. And then towards 2014, 2015, I got an opportunity to leave and to start a PhD. At the same time that happened, GDPR was very much part of the narrative in risk management context. And so I began to look at privacy and discovered that I really enjoyed it. So I never really enjoyed cybersecurity. We were longtime best friends, but never quite kind of got the same vibe from privacy or from cybersecurity as I did from privacy. So then I started a PhD in information privacy, and then I completed that in 2022. And if that wasn't tough enough, then I went on to write the book, The Privacy Leader Compass, which essentially was leveraging background in leadership, a background in cybersecurity, and a background in privacy. And then my co-author, obviously, a background in cybersecurity and privacy. So we combined minds to create, as we call it, 88 years of experience. So in the meantime, I started working in privacy. And so the last decade has been spent focused on working in privacy and in leadership. So that's been with BH Consulting for, in fact, 9 years almost. And so that's where it took me to today, the Chief Operations Officer in BH Consulting, who obviously do both cybersecurity and privacy and data protection consulting.
It's interesting because you've taken quite a long path, let's say, to get to your final destination, let's say. Well, if it is your final destination, we'll see in the future. But it's interesting because you see so many cases where privacy professionals are lawyers first. So given the fact that you don't have legal, or you didn't come from a legal background, let's say, how important do you think it is to have this legal background, or what other career paths do you see as being a natural fit based on your experience?
So it's a really interesting question, and it's one that's that that if you ask a lawyer, they're going to tell you obviously you need to have a legal background. But to be fair, I've spoken with and I'm good friends with many lawyers, and I think many would agree that to be a chief privacy officer, you really need to understand the law. You need to understand the law beyond privacy. You need to understand contract law, mergers and acquisitions. There's so much more you need to understand from a legal perspective. And you really want to make sure, if you're in that role, that you're going to cross the T's and dot the I's. And that's very much the CPO role. Now, the CPO is only one leadership role
Yeah.
in privacy, because we have many, many different roles that are associated with leading privacy. The CISO can often be the leader of the privacy function in a smaller organization. We have the CIO can be the leader of privacy. We've seen risk managers, legal managers. There's lots of different areas can lead privacy. We also see very senior DPOs who don't necessarily have a legal background, but have a robust understanding of that particular business or that industry leading privacy. So I don't think it's necessary to lead privacy, but I think it's necessary to be in a legal role, to have that legal background. But the legal role is really the CPO. And there's many CPOs, in fact, don't have a legal background, but predominantly they do.
So if you wanted to, let's say my objective wasn't necessarily CPO, but maybe DPO or privacy analyst, or, a different role in the privacy team, how feasible, how realistic is it, do you think, to not have any legal background?
Oh, I think it's more than feasible. I think it's common. And I think I've always said that, to me, the most important skill that we can have as privacy professionals is, I don't put the law up there at the top, it's project management, and most important skill. So I would say to anybody who's thinking about embarking on the career, what should I have as my base? I'd say start with a really, really robust project management background, learn project management, then build on it with privacy knowledge. But you're going to be in privacy, you're going to be asked to run multiple projects at the same time and be responsible for multiple aspects and multiple tasks at the same time. It's virtually impossible to do that if you don't know how to manage your time and other people, how to manage other people. And how to prioritize. And so these are skills that don't necessarily come naturally. And so I think that they're the foremost skill that we need to be learning. But legal, I think you can have a legal background, but I think there's so many other aspects, and that we'll be talking about as we go through this session today.
Well, maybe let's go there now. So let's say if I wanted to pursue a career in privacy, what would you think are the key skills that I would need to acquire?
So in the Privacy Leader Compass, I break them down into 3 distinct pillars. Some of them are very easy to learn. You just go on a course, you learn them. You do your certification and you learn them. Some of them are not so easy to learn, and you may never be able to learn them. And I'm not saying you need all of them. The more you have of them, obviously, the better you're going to be at your role. But we'll start as technical skills. Okay, now we can group them into there's project management skills. That's the obvious one, and I call that the foundational skill on which everything else is built. But you've got like cybersecurity. That's one of the many skills. It's actually quite lacking in a lot of privacy people. And I'm not saying that because I have it as a background. I'm saying it because when I meet people, I think, really, you should know this. You should know the difference between a firewall and a VPN. You should know when to use encryption. You should know what data classification is. You should know what the difference between different communication protocols are. You should know these things, not because they're just cybersecurity, but because they actually relate to the organizational and technical measures that you're supposed to understand need to be in place if you're responsible for privacy. So we should know these things. So think about getting a robust understanding in cybersecurity, a robust understanding of privacy laws and frameworks. Everybody goes GDPR the minute they think, because we're in Europe, obviously we think GDPR, but Orla, in Spain, you've got, I think it's Biometric Data Act, Biometric Act, I think it's called. There's a name for an additional piece of privacy legislation in Spain. In Germany, they've got about 50 other pieces of legislation. In Ireland, we have another 3 or 4 that we need to think about. That's just by our own sectors. And then if you look to the US, then there's, state laws that you have to think about. So not everybody thinks GDPR first, but I think for a lot of us, we do just go GDPR when we think of privacy legislation. if we think about what's coming from Europe right now, privacy leader really needs to think with a much wider lens. AI Governance Act, or AI Act, you got to think about how you're going to govern AI in your organization. What's the intersection between it and privacy?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pieces in there that can be quite complex. You've got to think about sector specific. So what sector are you in? Privacy laws apply in your sector, health sector in particular. There's a whole array of privacy legislation, pharma industry, clinical trials. There's a whole series of privacy legislation there. Are you public sector body? You know, you got to think about what are those additional acts that are coming at us from Europe. If you're financially regulated, again, additional acts coming from Europe, like DORA, those privacy sectors in there. HIPAA for health sector in the US, you could go on. So, you know, the legislation and understanding the legislation is really important. That's the technical skills, what I call technical skills.
Yeah.
On the other side, we've got business skills. We really need to understand risk management. You know, I've seen people talk about, some people call it the RACI, some people call it the RACI, but the RACI, how to understand how to actually do one, and what do they mean? It's not just, is it medium? You know, we don't just put our finger in the air. There's actually a formula and a science to creating a risk matrix. Understanding business strategy. So what is the business strategy? How can you align a privacy strategy if you don't know what a business strategy is? So it's understanding the business model, how the business takes value from data, what it needs data for. So it's relationship, a personal data's relationship to the business. Understanding stakeholders, understanding all the stakeholders and what are their needs. How you meet their needs, and that includes understanding, and I put this into a business skill because I think it is, understanding office politics, understanding the interrelationships between different teams and different parts of the organization and different organizations, even within a competitive component. And then reputation, the organization's reputation. You've got to understand the organization's reputation. Some organizations don't care about their reputation, and you know, it may not be so important to them. So understanding that. And then the final pillar, I think, is, and this is the most difficult, and I think as we get older, maybe we get better at some of these skills, but they're the softer leadership skills. So we can play in those two spaces. If we've got the technical skills and the business skills, we can play in the analyst space, we can play in the reporting space, the management or risk management space. But are we going to be able to lead a team of people? And are we going to be able to work with a lot of other people? And I think in that space, you're going to see those softer leadership skills. And they relate very much to emotional intelligence, you know, being aware of others, reading the room, being aware of ourselves, the listening piece, the listening skills, communication skills, including presentation skills, not doing death by PowerPoint, not, you know, understanding tone, understanding people's, you know, audiences, team building, how to create cohesive teams, how to create high-performing teams, how to create cohesiveness in teams, how not to, you know, conflict management, budgeting, which is a very peculiar one to say in terms of softer leadership skills. But when you get into the leadership space, suddenly you find yourself having to account and be responsible for a budget that has to be proportioned. And then the relationship building piece. And that's another really important piece, understanding who's who in the industry, who's who in the company, who's who across your networks, so that you can connect to them, find out, you know, what's happening in the industry. So they're the softer skills and probably the most difficult to learn.
Okay, I totally agree that, you know, it's not all about the tech skills at the end of the day. The general business skills and the soft skills, I think they play a vital role. You're dead right. One thing I do see time and time again is how under-resourced privacy teams tend to be. So you'll often find like a team of one or two, quite an isolated role. What, I suppose, advice or what skills do you think that they need within these ones that you've mentioned? Which ones do you think would play a vital role in helping them overcome that challenge, to make up for what they don't have?
Yeah, and actually, 9 times out of 10, That's the structure of the privacy role in the organization. They're either
Important. Yeah.
somebody who's doing another job, who's
Right.
taking on the responsibility of privacy, or else there's somebody who's just on their own, being the DPO and being an isolated entity. And actually, the DPO role, by its nature, kind of has to be isolated because
Mm.
they're not really part of the organization. They're the eyes of the supervisory authority in that organization. That's
Yeah.
essentially what they are. So, they're not likely to win friends and influence people in the organization as such. They're there to represent data subject rights, and they're there to make sure that they're enforced. And so they can feel quite isolated, and that's where those softer skills come in. I mean, how you connect to others, how you build relationships, how you communicate, how you manage conflict. These are all the important skills in that side of things. On resourcing, it's a really interesting piece. And a lot of DPOs in particular don't get the budget that they require. Even
Yeah.
though the legislation says that they should be resourced adequately, they don't.
Mm.
And so it's actually, how to get the most bang for your buck. And the way to do that, I think, is to leverage open tools. So to look for open source. We have, for instance, open source tools from the ICO in the UK for AI. We have an open source tool from GAI Orla is another one. So there's open source tools out there, leverage them. There's open source standards out there, NIST framework for cybersecurity and for privacy. So leverage open source tools because they cost you nothing other than attention. And so I would say, look to those kind of technical pieces to leverage those templates, a lot of free templates out there for those who want to use them. There's a lot of free courses. So, attend free courses, engage with advocacy groups, engage with lots of different groups, IAPP, for instance, ISACA. These groups allow you to connect with other people, to find out what's going on and to learn. And so engage with others and then connect with the business. Find out what's going on in the business and who you can get into bed with, metaphorically, of course, who you can get into bed with in the rest of the business that will resolve your feeling of isolation. Probably somebody else in risk management who may be also isolated, and engage with them to understand the business and to be able to kind of try to find an audience who will engage with you. And so they'd be the three areas I'd say that people should look to fill the gap.
And I suppose as well, so you mentioned earlier on the relationship building, so your skills to build relationships. And I think it's something that's undervalued in life in general. But in particular, as we're talking about privacy, it's applicable to everybody. So when you're in the organization and you are under-resourced, but you need collaboration across the entire organization. So you mentioned earlier on project management, you mentioned the relationship skills. So what advice could you give somebody, let's say, who is a one-man team, let's say, that's trying to get this collaboration across the organization? Because it's not as easy when you're asking people to get involved, but they've got their own objectives and their own, stresses and whatnot. So what advice would you give people, let's say, to try and help achieve that collaboration?
So my personal experience has been that to be heard, it depends on who you're speaking to. And so if you want to be heard by the person on the ground, appeal to their own personal use of data. So how do you use your data? What is it I can tell you about how to protect your children's data at home? When I bring these real world things to you, then you'll start to bring them into your daily practice. So that, I can help to change the culture of the organization by starting communicating to the person who's on the ground about how privacy affects their daily lives, and give them something. I always think if you give people something for nothing, give them the information that like how should you deal with? And I remember having this conversation from my CIO when I was working in the bank, where they came over and they said, my daughter is 8 and
Yeah.
she wants a mobile phone. What should I do?
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with the business, but what you've done is you've opened a door to say, come
Humanize.
to me and I will give you the answers to those questions.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to him, well, you have to decide yourself if, you'd be willing to invade her privacy, that maybe you want
Yeah.
to teach her a better way rather than invade her privacy. And he just laughed and he said, forget about that, Valerie. I'm happy to invade her privacy. I'm happy to. So let's move on to the second phase.
Yeah,
Tell me
exactly.
how. But that was just an experience, and I think when
Yeah.
you want to, so bring it to people to say to them, I am here to help.
Yeah.
But now the other piece is, how do you communicate to a board, to say to a
Of course.
board, I tell me if you want me to help you with your children's privacy policy. I don't think that's going to really
Yeah.
rate. But what about, I can show you how to make privacy profitable. That is what
Keyword.
they're listen to. Making privacy profitable. How do we operationalize that? I can bring that to you. Would you like to hear about that? I can save you money. Would you like to hear about that? That's, I think, how you can go about connecting to those different spaces.
Yeah.
I also think there's another space for larger organizations. So for that privacy person in larger organizations that have CSO reports, is to go to the marketing department and to say to the marketing department, I'm running a lot of stuff that's an amazing cultural change in the organization.
Yeah.
And I think we should put that in to our CSO reports, because there's a space for privacy within a CSO report. So let's promote what we do, because that your audience is going to be much wider than just the organization. Investors are going to be looking at that. The board are going to be looking at that. Non-executive board members are going to be looking at that. So there's a much wider audience that's going to see, we're making changes here. We're doing something really positive.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of the person you're talking to and understand, well, what is it that they want? How can I get them to see this as a priority for them, as opposed to them helping me achieve my goals?
Yeah,
that's one of the biggest mistakes sometimes that we make when we want to influence people out there, let's say.
Yeah, excellent point.
So for somebody, let's say, who is kind of questioning whether or not moving into the privacy space would be the right move for them, what advice could you give them to help them decide whether it's right for them or not?
Well, I would say there's a great book called From Good to Great by Jim Collins, and in it he talks about the hedgehog. And in the hedgehog space, he says an organization has to, if they want to do something, they have to look at 3 things, and it's in the middle of those, a pink Venn diagram, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And one of them is, what are you passionate about? So I think from good to great we can apply to ourselves as individuals. It's not just to organizations, but when we take the process, an age-old process, and we say, what are you passionate about? And then what are you best at? What are you really good at? So if you're passionate about privacy and you think you're really good at risk management, and then the final piece is, can you make it make money for you? Is there a living in it? And so you got to ask yourself those 3 questions. And in the center of those 3 questions is whether I want to go ahead and be in this space, because maybe I'm never going to be good at project management.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even put people off with that, because I'll be quite honest, I'm not a great project manager. And I've often said I'm not a great project manager, but I make sure I surround myself with great project managers, knowing that this is not a key skill that I bring to the table. I bring a lot of other skills, but that's not one of them. And so I always make sure that I have on my team a great project manager. But if I was solo, that would be a difficult space.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, I've learned project management skills, and I've learned to be as good as I can be. But for me, it's harder. I think it's not natural for me to be a great project manager. I think somebody else could probably be in that space much more fluidly than me, and probably not have to try as hard as me.
Yeah.
So, you know, what are you best at? Are you good at communication? Are you good at risk assessment? Are you good at structured approach? If the answer is yes to those, then you're in the right track. But you do have to be good at communication. Privacy is not a quiet space, unless, of course, you're into developing algorithms for differential privacy. You know,
if it's quiet, you might be doing it wrong.
Say again?
If it's quiet, you might be doing it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would be my kind of advice to somebody, is to look at those three spaces and see if you fit into the good to great space, and that hedgehog Venn diagram that Jim Collins wrote about. And I think that that's a great way to evaluate if you want to embark on privacy as a career. But I would also say to people that privacy has, you know, having come through the cybersecurity space, now being in the privacy space and reflecting back on it, cybersecurity isn't gender balanced, privacy is. And that brings with it a whole host of real positives, because it's a very balanced profession. It's one, when you go to a conference that's a privacy conference, you're going to see lots of women and lots of men. You know, it's a very equal industry. As a result, it's a very accepting one. So, you know, cybersecurity maybe isn't as easy. And you often find, you know, all male panels and all male speakers, and that can be quite frustrating. And so, you know, I don't have that experience in privacy since moving into privacy. And I think that's a real positive. So I think there's a lot of positives in the privacy space.
Yeah. Do you know, it's interesting when you say that there, actually, when you mentioned like going to conferences and stuff, and it's one of the things that has struck me since I've moved into the privacy space. While maybe in, you know, back in the company, you may feel quite isolated, but there's such a feeling of community in general among privacy people, whether it's on LinkedIn or whether it's at a conference. You genuinely feel like it's one big family and everyone is there to support each other. And I think it is important to leverage that, to take advantage and get to know as many people, network, not just inside the organization, but outside the organization.
And you know, it's not common in cybersecurity. There's one or two cybersecurity conferences, you know, and I would go to them regularly. ISACA would be one, and COSAC would be another, or SA also. Yeah. They would be very much like conferences that I feel are very pro-balance, you know, as much as they possibly can be. So you'll see an equal number of men and women speaking. So I think it's fantastic. I do have a problem when I see all male panels. It's a personal thing, I think, really, in this day and age. I never have that issue in privacy because there's always balance in privacy. But there's in cybersecurity, there's a group called No Q for the Loo, who are trying to encourage more women into the cybersecurity conferences, trying to encourage them in, saying it's the only time in a woman's life at a cybersecurity conference that there is no queue for the toilet because there's so few women at them.
Which we can all relate to.
Oh, yeah. But anyway, that's just...
Well, Valerie, I know we could be here all day chatting, but unfortunately we are tight on time. So I would like to thank you very much for your time today and for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank you to everyone who has taken the time to join us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I certainly did. I hope you did too, Valerie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Just to let you all know, the next roundtable discussion we'll be having is on May the 30th, led by Anthony Hibbert, and we will be exploring the techniques for data minimization and anonymization while leveraging large language models. So again, as I mentioned earlier, if anyone would like to join the community, please feel free to reach out to me directly, or as I mentioned, we'll put a link in the comments below. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.
See you guys.
Bye.